Hey everybody, this is Professor Phil Pinzoni. In today's lecture, this is lecture 11, we're going to be looking more deeply into forest disturbances. So we're going to run through the actual definition of a disturbance. We'll be able to classify different disturbances, mainly focusing on fire. We'll look at disturbance agents. We'll then get into tree responses to minor disturbances, and then disturbances and regeneration mechanisms. So disturbances are discrete events. And what does that mean? It means that they have a clear beginning and a clear end, both in space and time. These events, they alter a forest structure, for example, tree height, composition, for example, the abundance of different tree species, and function. So an example of that is erosion control. Some disturbances are caused by natural forces, others are again caused by humans, like logging. Now these disturbances, they definitely do kill some forests and some areas of intact forests, but they also open up spaces for a new forest. And we're going to learn about this process in today's lecture. The next thing we need to learn about is disturbance severity, and how disturbance severity is the product of two factors. Those two factors include external forces and internal susceptibility. So an external force is the force of a disturbance that is external to the trees that can be measured. This, again, has to be able to be measured. For example, wind speed and fire temperature. Both of those external forces can be measured. Next is the internal susceptibility. So the severity is going to depend on the external forces that can be measured and how susceptible those trees within those stands are. So for different species, you're going to have different susceptibility. There's clearly a ton of variation in susceptibility, and a great example of this is the October storm. If you live locally and you were alive in 2006, you actually might remember this October storm. In the early autumn, we had a lot of rain come down, and the temperature dropped. This layer of frozen water accumulated on trees, and then that layer of ice allowed more and more accumulation of snow. It was really wet, heavy snow, and because of that, we had many broadleaf trees lose their branches and topple over. Now, conifers, they accumulated this ice and snow less, so they were less susceptible. So it's a great example of how internal susceptibility is greatly dependent on the species at play. So again, we have the disturbance severity depending on external force and internal susceptibility. So the next thing we're going to learn about is the classification of disturbances. As you know, disturbances come in many forms, right? There isn't just one type of disturbance. There are an infinite number of disturbances, from the severity all the way to the size affected. We're going to better understand these. The first thing we're going to learn about is the severity of effects. Now, severity, the way we're going to look at severity is it comes in three flavors. So we have a high disturbance severity, we have a medium disturbance severity, and we also have a low disturbance severity. So in a high disturbance severity, we are going to see all trees and all understory plants completely removed. In addition, you're going to have that dead ground cover also removed. A great example of a disturbance that has a high severity is unsustainable logging practices known as clear cutting, in which everything is removed. Not only are all these plant individuals removed, but after the plant material is taken away from that system, the debris is piled up and is burned. So after slash and burn, you have nothing remaining. Everything's removed, everything changes. That is a really high disturbance severity. The next is a medium disturbance severity. In this scenario, you have many trees removed, but also many trees are remaining in that system. A great example of this is a more sustainable logging practice known as selective logging, in which maybe 50% of the trees are logged or less. Another example of this is a disease. So a disease might run through an ecosystem or a parasite or pathogen in which maybe 50% of the mature individuals are removed. So the system is still intact, but many individuals are removed. In the third scenario, we have a low severity. In this scenario, few trees are killed. An example of this is wind blowing down an individual tree or from very selective logging practices. We're going to have to know this term known as biological legacies. Now, biological legacies are materials that are left behind following a disturbance. So these can include living trees, dead trees, seeds, logs, and microtopography. So we're going to have to know that. Definitely understand what a biological legacy is. And you should also know this interaction, that the higher the severity of a disturbance, the fewer the biological legacies that are left behind. So in less severe disturbances, you're going to have more biological legacies left behind. In high disturbances, you're going to have less of these legacies behind. When there's less legacies behind, the system is more likely to change from its original state. In addition to disturbance severity, a very important part of disturbances is how frequent they are. So we're going to have to better understand the frequency of disturbances and all of the terminology that's associated with frequency. So if we look at this picture on the right here, this is a portion of the cross section of a tree, and we have those thick dark patches within the organism's rings, and those indicate a fire scar. So a single interval is the number of years between two consecutive disturbances in a single site. The fire scar shown here occurred in 1715, and the second one in 1730. So this single fire interval is of 15 years. Now, if we zoom out, we can see that is more than just a single interval of these fire disturbances. And if you add up and divide by the number of the disturbances, you get an average interval. So the average interval for all of these disturbances is 9.25 years. So if the average interval is long, then the disturbance frequency is going to be low. Oppositely, if the average interval is short, then the disturbance frequency is going to be high. So the disturbance frequency is the inverse of the average interval. So this average disturbance interval over thousands of years will certainly select for certain species. So let's look at this species on the left. These aspens, they live a relatively short life, especially compared to the California redwood on the right. So organisms that live shorter lifespans, they are going to show up in areas with a lower average interval. That means, again, the frequency is going to be smaller between these disturbances, right? So if an ecosystem is constantly having a disturbance every 5 years, right? I mean, that's extreme, but like maybe every 20 or 30 years, that ecosystem is gonna select for species that have a shorter life cycle. Oppositely, if we look at these California redwoods that live thousands of years, they live in systems that have a average interval that is much larger. So their disturbances, they face disturbances at much greater timescales. This selects for much longer lived species. So again, I like how we're tying these ideas. We're learning about this, that the actual frequency and the average interval of these disturbances has a strong selective power on the actual species that show up here. So we already looked at the severity of disturbance, the frequency of disturbance, and how those impact all these ecological interactions. The next thing we're going to focus on is the spatial pattern of these disturbances, and we are going to note 4 differences in these disturbance patches. So the first thing we're going to look into is the dispersion of a disturbance. In the case of a forest fire, there can be one single forest fire. If there's not a lot of wind, there could just be one fire that slowly burns through an ecosystem. On a windy day, though, embers can be flying around and you could have many forest fires. Like this 1910 fire, this was not just one single fire disturbance. This was at the same time, and you had all these separate fires raging at the same time. It happened to be a super windy day, and these embers were moved all over this landscape. The next of the 4 differences has to do with size. So disturbance can be large or it can be a small disturbance. So this clearly in Glacier National Park, this disturbance was rather large, right? You can see the scale. Several miles of forest were engulfed by this 1910 fire. The next spatial pattern we're going to look at is the actual shape. So man-made disturbances, they're usually going to take a geometric shape because that's the way land is divvied up, and that just is more efficient for machinery to take these forest products from. A natural disturbance like a fire is not going to be geometric. It's going to have shapes that we are seeing on the right hand of the screen. On the bottom, you could see these complex multi-armed fire patches. We learn what biological legacies are, and these can vary from there not being any living legacy trees, but many legacy dead trees or logs. After clear-cut logging, for example, you have very few living trees, but you do have some of these logs left behind. And this varies to the other extreme. There could be many patches of live legacy trees and few logs after a large fire with one of these unique shapes too. So patches of live legacy trees are usually created by complex topography or hydrography protecting some areas from disturbance. So the shape of the land, the amount of moisture in certain patches of land can allow these legacies to show up. Now, for seed dispersal success, a seed is going to be able to germinate more likely after a disturbance with a irregular shape and a smaller disturbance. Natural reforestation through seed dispersal is going to be most successful in small, complex shaped patches that contain many biological legacies. The more legacies, the more living trees, the um, the greater the seed production. So you're going to have a better reforestation. Natural reforestation is going to be least successful in large, geometrically shaped patches that contain no legacies. So on the right, we have this irregular shape. It's relatively small, and you can see why these irregular shapes are going to have a greater reforestation, right? There's more surface area. If you outline the shape of these irregular disturbances, there's going to be a greater perimeter. There's going to be living trees outside of that perimeter. Thus, there's going to be these legacies that can easily drop their seeds in these patches. Oppositely, this is from Google Maps. These are 1 mile by 1 mile grids. And again, this is a great example of human disturbance. This is how land is divvied up. This is how foresters, many clear-cut foresters, work. If you look at one of these sections of a clear-cut disturbance, many seeds are not going to make their way to the middle of these disturbances. So this is for several reasons. One of them is that there's just much less, there's a smaller perimeter around these disturbances, unlike these irregular disturbances to the right, and there's going to be less seed production around these disturbed sites. The third part of this lecture, we're going to be talking about disturbance agents, and we are going to actually continue to delve into this even with more great detail. So, fire. This is one of the main disturbance agents that we are going to learn about. We should know the basics of fire, in that it's a natural force that is actually a chemical reaction. Fire is the oxidation of different chemicals that occurs when wood is heated up by lightning or by the flame from a match. Fires, we should note, occur globally. Now, this map shows the relative incidence of fires and fires per kilometer per year. And these higher numbers, these darker colors, are going to be burned more so by fires. These results were based on a 10-year data set. And this map shows that all vegetated areas burn frequently, with only areas of desert or tundra having few fires. Now, these areas have few fires because one of the main reasons that we're going to continue to revisit is the amount of fuel in those lands. The annual area burned is positively going to be correlated with aridity. So more arid environments, drier environments are going to have more incidents of fire. If we look in the United States, the darker, those red and darker, more maroon colors are going to have, they're going to be drier areas compared to, as you can see, where from like a light orange, almost yellow region, we do get a great amount of precipitation. Fuel dryness is increased by weather that is hot and rainless, and this is decreased by weather that is cool and rainy. Fire area as a function of fuel aridity, we can see this on the western side of our country. You can see that a fire area is greater when the fuel is drier. So that makes a lot of sense. The drier ecosystems are going to have drier fuel. That drier fuel is going to have a greater chance to catch on fire. These blue data and these red data are made up of different dates. In more recent years, we're going to have larger fire areas because of this. The West Coast is experiencing much more drought. because of this human climate change. In past years, there's been more rain. So, with that in mind, that fuel is going to be the fuel in the past was less arid, so the relative area for fires was smaller compared to more modern times. There are several different types of fires, and the first fire type we're going to learn about is a surface fire. Now, a surface fire occurs when dead wood and dry grasses and shrubs, and sometimes even those first organic layers of that soil surface are set ablaze. Now, they occur either when conditions are not too dry or not too windy, or when there is no ladder fuel. So, what is ladder fuel? Ladder fuel is the woody material that many larger trees sometimes have that allows a surface fire to actually climb up to the canopy. So, with these low-lying horizontal branches, that fire can then climb up to the canopy. So, in the lack of ladder fuels, you'll have more incidents of surface fires. I just want you to think briefly about that light environment that we were focusing on a lot last lecture. In the presence of a lot of light, you're going to have conifers that have more ladder fuel. In a old growth, darker area, you're not going to have much ladder fuel. So I want you to keep that in mind. Again, remember how the light environment might shift ladder fuels, and with that understanding, we can realize that a light environment can actually completely alter a disturbance regime. Now, crown fires, they burn in the tree crowns. They're going to occur when weather is dry enough to make foliage like needle leaves and broadleaves more flammable. When it's windy enough to move flames between crowns, you're going to have more incidents of crown fires, and when there is this ladder fuel that connects the surface fire to those tree crowns. Trees are killed by two types of fires. Crown fires kill in two ways: by the combustion of all the leaves and buds. We learned last lecture about this, how if a tree is reduced greatly by a disturbance, if 50% or more of its buds or leaves are destroyed, most trees die. So if this happens to a mature tree, if most of its buds and leaves are killed, that plant is most likely not going to make it. The second way is if a section of the complete lateral meristem is heated up and killed, then you're not going to have that movement of products throughout the tree. There's going to be a blockage surrounding the circumference and maybe just one area, but if that section is not able to conduct products from photosynthesis or water and nutrients from the soil, then that plant eventually will die. Crown fires they're going to cause the trunk of the tree to be consumed, completely burned away, if the tree has a trunk with a small diameter. Trees with a small diameter, the heat of the fire is going to actually force the moisture within that tree out of the tree, and what's going to happen is that the entire tree is going to go up in flames and the entire tree is going to be consumed. Now, larger diameter trees interacting with a crown fire, the intense heat of that crown fire is actually going to force the water inside the heartwood instead of outside. So obviously some water does escape with this intense heat, but much of the moisture actually gets forced in to the heartwood, and this is when we see a lot of dead standing trees. So we know that a dead standing tree is called a snag. We see a lot of snags after intense crown fires because the water is forced in the middle of that heartwood. Surface fires can also kill a tree. So even if the fire doesn't reach the crown, that surface fire, it can kill a complete section of the lateral meristem, and that will again disallow products moving from the leaves or soil nutrients and water moving from the soil. Many times, in this picture on the right, we're seeing again the entire lateral meristem is not burned, and when you only have a section burned, you have these fire scars. Now, these are extremely useful in the study of dendrochronology because we can then come up with this frequency of fire disturbance. Without fuel, there's no fire. And as a forest ages, you get an accumulation of fuel. Photosynthesis drives the development of more tissues. The older a stand becomes, the more of this tissue develops, alive or dead. So through time, you get an increase in fuel buildup. Now, the levels of fuel in a forest actually does not increase the chance of forest burning. It does, however, increase the intensity of the fire, but not the frequency of those fire disturbances. To understand these interactions more completely, let's look at these Yellowstone fires of 1988. And in the bottom right, you're going to see just a straight up satellite image. This satellite image had a sensor that recorded the visible spectrum. As you can see, you can't really see much, and it took me a second to realize what this was. I thought this was just a picture of the sky, and this was just, some clouds throughout the sky. But this is actually a top-down view of a forest, and this is all of the smoke that you see pouring out of this fire. The picture above this satellite image is using a camera, and that sensor is different. That sensor actually records thermal energy. And with that smoke does not get in the way, and you could actually see where these fires are raging. And it's images like this that truly help people on the ground fight fires. So that's an interesting idea about, the type of radiation a sensor can capture. With this image, we realize that the fire intensity was much higher in the park itself. So the intensity, remember we just learned about this slide. Because there is more debris on the inside of the park, there was a much higher intensity on the inside of the park. Why was there so much more fuel on the inside of the park? This also had to do with fire, because in previous years, for the past 80 to 100 years, people working here continuously put out these forest fires. We didn't actually understand that fire is absolutely necessary to maintain ecological function of an area. So what did we do? We put out all these fires. As time progressed, you get these extremely high fuel loads, and that is why this protected park raged in 1988. Nowadays, we have a better understanding of fire, and we don't just willy-nilly put out all fires. We let them go for a bit. Sometimes we do actually prescribed fires to try and mediate these fire disturbances because these are natural events. So the United States is a rather large country. And because of its size, you get different areas that acquire different levels of moisture, different levels of light, and you get totally different species assemblages across this vast landscape. Because of that, you get totally different ecosystems, and because of that, you get different fire frequencies. So, for example, in the southwest of this country, you're going to have ecosystems dominated by ponderosa pine. These ecosystems naturally, pre-human establishment, had a fire regime or a fire frequency of less than 10 years, right? So that is a very high frequency event. Less than 10 years, you're having fires burn through an area, right? Pre-human on the northeast of this country, in ecosystems dominated by maple, these systems are much wetter. And on the top right hand corner, you see a picture of one of these more moist deciduous forests dominated by these maples. And you're going to have a fire frequency of greater than 1,000 years, right? So very low levels of frequency. Does not happen often, and we should understand that across this landscape of our country, we get totally different frequencies of fire disturbances. Now on the bottom, we see an ecosystem, and this is a picture taken at the same position over 80 years. And this ecosystem is in the southwest. It's dominated by ponderosa pine. And in recent times, after we have established ourselves in these areas, on the southwest side of the country, we are decreasing these fire frequencies. So these fires are happening at longer intervals. Oppositely, in the northeast maple dominated forests, these once very low frequency events are actually becoming more increased. So that frequency is actually increasing on the northeast. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. And I just think it's really interesting that two totally different ecosystems are going in the opposite directions in terms of their fire frequency. So in terms of the southwestern ponderosa pine dominated ecosystems, humans have put out more and more fires. Because humans put out fires, they do this because, again, they're protecting themselves, they're protecting their property, and they just don't want fire. We've always had a negative connotation towards forest fires. Now we know better, but in the past, especially, this started in the 1800s, especially in the early 1900s, we just put out all fires. And this was not a very good thing to do for these ponderosa pine ecosystems. So by decreasing the fire frequency, you have this succession of these forests. So you can see these three pictures on the bottom. You could see all the new young trees that show up in 1989. You get more and more growth. Look at how open the ecosystem is in 1909. In 1989, it's completely closed, right? The individuals, the young individuals, the juvenile trees in 1989, they weren't allowed to grow pre-human establishment because these fires would kill most of these juvenile trees, right? Now with our fire suppression, this frequency becomes decreased, and you get more and more fuel loads, right? So that's a current theme that we keep on revisiting, is that we've put out fires and we increase the fuel load. And now when a fire ignites, the intensity is much different than when it was historically, right? So all in all, we have definitely decreased the fire frequency in the Southwest. Oppositely, we've increased the fire frequency in the Northeast. So humans, we have bonfires, many people smoke cigarettes, and these can over time relate to more fires. So for these anthropogenic reasons, the Northeast is experiencing more fires than historical evidence, than tree ring analysis has shown us. The next thing we're going to look at is this fire patch animation. And this animation is real data taking place in Alaska. And we're going to look at how the shape of a fire starts circular. And as time progresses, you get a more complex shape. This is due to the wind direction shifting. And you'll also notice that the unburned legacy patches in some large burned areas will eventually reestablish themselves through seeds. So, again, another theme that keeps on occurring is this geometry of disturbance, how human disturbances have a very geometrical shape, and that doesn't procure a regrowth like a natural, more complex shape like we'll see on the next slide. So this is a rather large disturbance in 2004, and you could see how these fires start in a circular fashion. Now this area that we're looking at is absolutely massive. Obviously, if you look at the time of year, this is in the summer when fire occurs most. Fire does not occur in the winter in Alaska. So about 3 months of burning in Alaska. Again, you can see how the geometry changes. So besides fire, there are many other disturbance agents that we'll get into. We won't go into as thoroughly as we have with fire disturbances, but these other disturbances include wind. Wind is the movement of gas along an air pressure gradient. Now, if a tree is really rigid, then those trees are going to be more susceptible to snapping. The opposite of a rigid tree would be a very flexible tree. So, palm trees are trees that live in tropical or coastline ecosystems, and they have evolved a very flexible stem that can withstand hurricane winds. Now, this picture depicted on the right in Oregon in December of 2007 shows some very rigid pine species, and there were some record winds in the area, and you see this mass snapping event. This was probably a snowball effect, because as that leading side that was most exposed to the wind snapped, those snap trees would let in more wind. So this probably was this kind of positive feedback with more and more trees snapping. The more of them snapping, the more wind would actually be able to interact with the entire stand. Another disturbance is liquid in the form of floods. So we know that there are many habitats that are more susceptible to flooding just based on geography and hydrology. Um, when there's too much water in an ecosystem, those plants living there, they will not be able to metabolize the sugar in their roots. They won't be able to respirate from their roots and access those photosynthates, and they will definitely die. So, plants, although they require carbon dioxide to carry out photosynthesis, they also need oxygen to carry out their cellular respiration when they go in and tap into their carbon stores. So when there's too much water, the soil becomes anoxic and they're not going to be able to actually tap into their food stores. Solid and liquid in the form of landslides. We see a lot of landslides to this day. They can be triggered by earthquakes. They can be triggered by lots of rain. They can be triggered by deforestation. So a landslide can cause, it's more of a local disturbance, but they can cause some serious damage. So lastly is this biological agent, and this can come in the form of animals and diseases. So animals can be herbivores. They can be eating a lot of this vegetation and changing the system as a whole, just simply through herbivory, and we're going to get into that. Again, think about our experiment and how we're going to simulate herbivory. And then the other biological agent could be diseases. We're seeing a lot of diseases throughout ecosystems. We're definitely going to get into more specific details later on in this um, course. Now we're going to look at how trees respond to minor disturbances. Scars are created when some force kills a part of the lateral meristem. So these forces include fire, like we already learned about, tree fall, animal activity, and avalanches. So an avalanche actually came through, and that solid and liquid debris, actually the force of that liquid and solid debris killed this portion of the lateral meristem. That part of the lateral meristem died. And you can actually see a crack from that force that almost reached the absolute center of that heartwood. Now, this tissue is dead. It no longer will actually grow laterally because much of its lateral meristem was not killed. This tree was allowed to continue living past this disturbance. But you could see, and you could actually use these rings and find out when exactly this avalanche happened. So an unscarred area might actually regrow kind of over that scar and might actually sometimes hide some of that scar. So you can see that in these green arrows on this cross section from this individual, that the entire scar actually isn't exposed because you had the living meristem kind of encroach over a portion of the scar. Sometimes roots get buried. Now a root might get buried by more soil, by the movement of wind, and by the movement of water or other disturbances, maybe people landscaping, for example. But if roots get buried, the tree growth is going to be progressively lower the more deeply this tree's stem is buried. This decline is due to changes in oxygen and water availability. We already talked about how plants that are totally saturated with water aren't going to have more access to oxygen, and oxygen is a requirement, especially around the roots. So the more these roots are buried, the less oxygen is available, and you're going to change these water dynamics allowed at the roots. Additionally, you're changing the composition of bacteria and fungi that might provide nutrients to the roots. So this disturbance, all in all, is it results in a progressively lower growth of that tree individual. The tree will, however, respond by this to creating new lateral roots. So this picture, you can see these lateral roots radiating out from the stem of this plant. This is in a beached site, so really sandy. Sand is a completely dynamic environment. You have these dunes that could show up overnight. A sand dune surrounded this plant on its base, and how did the plant respond? Well, it put out these lateral roots. So next I want to look at this graph right above this picture, which shows this species in this growth pattern of this species, Thuja occidentalis, also known as the northern white cedar. Now, these northern white cedar, it follows this trend that we're talking about. Its total biomass actually decreases with increased burial. So individuals that are more buried are going to have less biomass. The next thing we need to talk about is where these roots actually come from. So this tree that has been growing in this beached habitat, it shot out these lateral roots, and it could have shot out these roots through axillary buds. We've learned about axillary buds and how vascular plants produce these types of buds. And if these axillary buds are buried, then instead of putting out new shoots and new leaves, they'll actually put out roots. However, this brownish rectangle shows that if secondary growth ensues too long, then these axillary buds actually get buried within the wood of the individual, and they will be no longer, there's no way they'll ever become activated again. So again, this secondary growth might actually cover axillary buds. When that happens, the tree does have a workaround, and it has to produce these adventitious buds that stems from the lateral meristem. So if those axillary buds are covered with wood, then the tree must produce these adventitious buds from the formation of the lateral meristem. So the final topic we'll touch on in this lecture is forest regeneration, how a forest regenerates after a disturbance. There's several theories that have to do with this, and we're going to focus on a few of them, but we should start with that after a disturbance, you're going to have vegetation actually uses many methods to regrow in that area. The second thing we're going to learn about is how the dominant type of regeneration varies with disturbance severity. So depending on how severe the disturbance is, you're going to have completely different regeneration methods. For example, if we look at this figure to the right, let's look at the severe side of things: landslides, erosion, and glacier. So a really extreme example is glaciation, right? If you're sitting near Buffalo, New York right now, 10,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice over your head. Now, these glaciers that once persisted here, they were dynamic. They advanced and they retreated, and that movement actually scraped away all of the biological legacies left behind in the past, all the way down to just straight up bedrock. So that's an extreme example. After those glaciers receded, after the planet warmed up and those glaciers melted, you have this land, this bare rock, and the only thing that will grow there are plants that have wind-blown seeds. So you can see the regeneration method is highly dependent on the severity of the actual disturbance. In a high severity event, you're going to have literally everything die, right? A medium severity event, you're going to have about half of those individuals die. And in a medium event, because there is actually a legacy there, you can actually have regeneration from not just windblown seeds. Yes, windblown seeds can get in there because there's open spaces, but you're going to have regeneration from other mechanisms like root sprouts. So in a hot fire, all the above ground tissue might be burned and killed, but the roots actually can still be alive. So the plant will actually put out a sprout from the root. In a cooler fire, the not all the above ground tissue is burned, and you might have a what might look like a snag might actually produce a living shoot. So you get these stump sprouts from a cooler fire. A low severity event, most seedlings, even the most vulnerable um, age group, most seedlings are still going to be alive. So examples of these are avalanches, wind throw, and logging. So from highest to low severity, the favored regeneration mechanisms obviously are going to change. So seed dispersal is going to be most prevalent in high severity disturbances. Buried seeds and sprouting, you're going to see that regeneration tactic in those medium severity disturbances. And advanced regeneration is in low severity disturbances. So advanced generation is basically the slow march from a undisturbed disturbance, an undisturbed plot of land that encroaches that disturbed land. If a site is denuded, which means that all the vegetation is destroyed in a high severity disturbance, then seed dispersal is the only way there's going to be forest regeneration. Now, seed dispersal can come through, can be vectored by animals on external, like burrs, for example, clinging onto the fur of mammals or birds. You have catches like several rodent species that actually store and stow away acorns, for example, for throughout the winter season. And you have internal dispersal, such as an animal eating a berry or a fruit and having that seed actually pass through the digestion, being excreted out in a nutrient rich poop, and then that plant can then get a start that way. Seed dispersal, usually because not many animals come into an area that's freshly denuded. Usually the first successional species are wind dispersed organisms. Now these individuals are going to have plumes like the cottonwood, wings like the maple seeds, and they are going to be more readily dispersed from taller individuals and more readily dispersed in high wind events. So that kind of is an interesting evolutionary question that I just want to briefly touch on is height. Clearly, we talk about how taller trees are more readily able to compete in a forest as they can reach above the canopy. But we know that plants are quite plastic and they can live centuries in the understory. However, evolutionarily speaking, you're going to have taller individuals have more of their genes passed on because of these dispersal events. So even though it might seem to us as like super competitive advantage of growing tall might just be a remnant of dispersal. I think that's an interesting idea. Now, there are also plants that have self dispersal. Poppy, for example, and mistletoe, I know, and this Himalayan balsam has these. It literally these seed pods reach a breaking point. Water is allocated to them, and they literally burst and explode seeds. But again, in systems that have been completely denuded, usually the first successional species to advance there are these wind dispersed species. So buried seeds can actually provide regeneration if the soil was undisturbed. So these buried seeds can cause forest regeneration following a medium severity, not a severe, not an extremely severe disturbance, but a medium severity disturbance. You can have buried seeds um, providing this regeneration. Now, after seeds are dispersed by wind or animals, or some self dispersal that we just learned about, some get buried in the soil and remain there. Um, I teach an environmental biology class as well, and we go over the extinction events. We learn about the KT extinction that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs and the rise of mammals. Now, people don't realize that plants, after that nuclear winter, that year of no sunlight, plants just started growing again, and that is because there was a intact seed bank. So it's important to note, though, that a seed bank does lose viability. Most seeds lose viability in a few years. They will no longer be able to sprout because the energy reserves are all used up by the embryo. Remember, the embryo within a seed is still living, and it needs to be slowly supported by these energy reserves. Many times you have fungi and bacteria that get through that seed coat and start feeding on the embryo and or the reserves put aside from its parent plant. Some seeds like cherries are, however, viable for decades. So that's an interesting fact for you, right? So cherries, who'd have thought? So since disturbances decrease canopy cover, they increase the heat and light that reach the seeds buried in the soil. And that heat and light may stimulate the germination of those buried seeds. So that's another fact that we should take in, that this increase in heat and light actually stimulates those seeds to sprout. So sprouting can occur if the basal parts of this tree were not killed by the disturbance. These sprouting events can and usually show up after medium severity disturbances, like after logging, or if an individual is snapped by wind, or if they have been around a moderate fire. After these moderate disturbances, there is still living tissue in the basal parts of the tree, and those tissues can then still produce sprouts if the tree isn't that damaged. Root sprouts form from adventitious buds that can form in the lateral meristem. Now, many tree species can have stem sprouts from their roots. This picture to the right is from a beech tree. Beech is notorious for putting out these root sprouts. Now, many species do this when the main stem is weakened, like if they're interacting with one of these disturbances. Other individual species, they do this when the tree is healthy, and by doing so, the tree can spread spatially and occupy more space. So you guys know I went to the West Coast last year, and I actually saw these California redwoods, and this is actually how they regenerate. They actually don't depend on seed for regeneration. They actually just put out these root sprouts. And in doing so, they can then advance their area, which is a really cool. I got to see that with my own two eyes. Now, stump sprouts form from adventitious buds that can form in the lateral meristem as well. Stump sprouts can form in most hardwoods and some conifers. They will be able to grow quite vigorously. because there's already a root system in place. This usually results in multiple stems, which is not a tree form favored by loggers. They can't use this woody material as large support beams or sheets of wood from these small stems. And you guys should remember that multiple stems suggest that the tree in that forest is not an old growth. The last way a forest regenerates is a term called advanced regeneration. Now, this ensues if a low severity disturbance kills some canopy individuals but leaves the understory or seedlings alive. So it is these younger understory and seedling individuals that will then regenerate. And again, you only see this in very low disturbances. Every year, new seedlings sprout from seeds, and the first part of their life, they are called seedlings. A seedling is considered a seedling if it's less than 3 feet tall and 1 inch in diameter. It's then considered a sapling when it gets greater than 3 feet tall and larger than 1 inch in diameter. In general, if 1,000 seeds are dispersed in an area, only 100 of them will actually germinate into seedlings. 10 of those will survive to be saplings, and only 1 will eventually become a mature tree. So again, this is why plants produce so many seeds, especially in these forest ecosystems, because there's just not that great of a success rate. Some seedlings survive many, many years. Again, a seedling is less than 3 feet tall and 1 inch in diameter. So in a extremely closed system, for example, in a really closed oak system, there can actually be oak individuals that are seedlings, less than 3 feet tall, less than 1 inch in diameter, that can be 15 years old. After around 15 years, their stem dies and a new stem sprouts from the roots. So a similar example is this picture on the right. This is a cross section of a Douglas fir that grew in an understory within a ponderosa pine stand. Now, dendrochronologists were shook when they took this cross section because they counted 103 rings. This individual was over 100 years old. It has a diameter slightly larger than this nickel, and you can see in a environment that is completely closed, you have this extremely fine growth each year. So I think that is such a cool figure to look at. So this concludes this second online lecture. I wasn't able to use footage from some of my adventures I went on this week in this lecture, but definitely next week I got out into the DeVoe Woods in Niagara Falls. I went into an old growth, so we'll have some more footage next week. Thank you for your attention. Keep up with your readings, keep healthy, and I will post another 2 lectures next week.